Hello, it's Sophy Ridge at the Sky News Westminster Studios on this edition of The Daily. Later we'll talk to a pilot and aviation consultant about the person who died and several others were injured on a London to Singapore flight during severe turbulence. It had to land in Thailand. But first, in this massive international election year, there was a time that net zero policies might have felt a bit of a sideshow. But for elections here in the US and in the EU, they've inched towards the centre stage. Now, scientists say the planet needs to halve greenhouse gas emissions within 6 years, so there's pressure for quick action. But with that pressure comes resistance, and governments and potential governments are now rolling back on some green measures that not all voters feel they can stomach. Well, this episode takes us 180 miles from Parliament's decision makers to Port Talbot, where Jason is a steelworker.
It's still costing 2,800 livelihoods. That's 2,800 families across the South Wales area affected by this. That's 2,800 opportunities in an industry that won't be there anymore.
They've been making steel there for 125 years, but the plant is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in Britain. So to improve, that means big changes and possibly redundancy for someone like Jason. Well, Nick Martin is Sky's correspondent on this one. Nick, I'll just say it straight away. I'm such a fan of the work that you do at Sky. You know, you're not one of these journalists who just taps away behind the computer. You're someone who gets out, talks to people, gets under the skin of areas and discovers the stories of these areas. And you've been in Port Talbot, right?
Yeah, Port Talbot's a place I've probably been going to 15, 16 years, telling that steel story as it ebbs and flows. Remember, the steel story in the UK has been around and bubbled around for a long time. Is it going to collapse? Is it going to survive? Who's going to bail it out? So it's not a new story for me. But this particular story takes us, I think, to the next chapter of the story of UK steel. Let me just paint a picture of Port Talbot. There it is, down on the south coast of Wales. It's nestled between Swansea to the west and Cardiff to the east. Beautiful beaches, rolling hills. And then there's this big old steelworks right in the middle of it. And it belches out steam and dust. But people around there, they love it. You know, it's like it's revered. Why? Because it's part of their heritage. It's been there 125 years. But it's also part of their livelihood. And thousands of people around there rely on it for work. It's a classic case of an industrial town. It's a big employer. As I say, about 4,000 people work there. And there's a problem, though. The steelworks is a polluter. In fact, Sophie, get this, it's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, that factory, in Britain.
Wow.
And that goes to the heart of how steel is made. We've got blast furnaces. They're fired by coal. We melt a load of iron. It goes out the bottom and we make steel. And all of that goes into the atmosphere with pollution. And Tata Steel, who own that steelworks, like other industries across Britain and across the world, are under a lot of pressure to clean up because we've got targets to clean up. And that is the nub of this problem, the dilemma between going green and the impact that that has on workers.
It's such a dilemma, isn't it? Because as you say, you spell it out like that, the biggest greenhouse gas emitter. I mean, I had no idea. But also, like you say, for these communities, it's such a big deal. Like, my granddad was a steel worker in Sheffield. It is such a big part of these communities' identities. And also, like you say, it's jobs, isn't it? So what is the way forward then? What's going to happen?
Well, to understand why we're talking about this and why there's so much change, we need to understand what's been going on in the world. Demand for steel plummeted in the pandemic because we weren't making roads and cars and things like that. But also China has produced loads of cheap steel and flooded the market. So the UK steel industry is actually tiny. It's a shadow of what it was. In fact, in the UK, steel workers amount to 0.1% of the entire workforce. But it's still important. We still need steel for our cars and our roads and our washing machines and all that kind of stuff. And so the UK government and Tata, in fairness to them, want to preserve a steel industry in the UK. But as I say, they're under a lot of pressure. They want to shut down the 2 current blast furnaces, which are belching out all those emissions, and they want to rebuild an electric one, a greener one. But Tata say to do that, they've got to shut them down, shut the plant down and build it, and that's going to take 4 or 5 years. They do not need around 2,800 workers anymore, so they're urging them to take voluntary redundancy. Now, the unions are saying, well, can you not keep one open, save the workers and still build your furnace? Tata say no. Why? Because they're losing money hand over fist. If Tata are to be believed, they're losing £1 million a day. And so they say the only option, if the workers and the families around there want to keep steel in that area, is to shut the plant down and rebuild this new future.
Do we believe Tata? Am I being a bit cynical here?
I think when you look at Tata's figures, we can understand that they are in trouble from a UK perspective. They've got lots of interests in the Netherlands and in India, their home country. But the economic situation in the UK really does sort of stack up when they talk about the problems that they're having. The government know this as well. So this new electric arc furnace is going to cost £1.25 billion. The UK government are paying 500 million of that, around half of that, is in a subsidy. But the jobs will still go. Labour say, well, we'd still pay that £500 million, but we'd pay a little bit more, up to 200 million more, if we could save the jobs. Tata say, no way, the sums just don't add up. It's this way or nothing.
Let's hear from Jason, shall we? Because you've met Jason, haven't you, and his family. And I guess it kind of really brings home the human interest of the story, doesn't it? What it means for the workers.
Yeah, Jason's a nice guy. I met him and his family in Port Talbot the other week. He's been a steel worker for 25 years. He's a skilled guy. He's an electrical engineer. So like a lot of steel workers, well paid, skilled workers, but he's worried that him and his colleagues are going to lose out because of this green transition.
It's been crap, in all honesty. They're asking people to save the business with forfeiting their jobs. The top bottom of it is. So yeah, it's hard work.
He's not against the move to green. In fact, he believes that the electric arc furnace is the future, but he thinks the way that Tata are going about it is going to damage them. And it really does, Sophie, get to the heart of the cost of growing green for families like this. His wife Stacey's worried about her job in the wider community. His son Tyler, who's only 19, wanted to be an apprentice at the plant, but isn't going to do that now. It's too risky.
I think it's wrong what Tata Steel are doing to their workers. Obviously, lots of them have worked there for years, do you know what I mean? And sometimes, in a way, it's like this if they're just turning their back on everyone and they don't really care about how it's going to affect people, how it's going to affect their families.
It's interesting because Jason has kind of taken on a kind of informal union role. He's not a big regional organiser, he's not a national organiser, but I think he realises this is his time to fight for his family. And so we followed him all the way up to Manchester, the 6-hour journey to a big union march where, I don't know, he was like a celebrity. People were coming up to him, chatting to him, saying, Jason this, Jason that.
Oh my God, Jason's the man!
It's an honour to meet you. Honestly.
And he was being quite humble about it, saying, I'm only a steel worker. But deep down, he knows that he's in the fight of his life, like all of the other steel workers there.
They are, right at this very moment, trying to destroy the livelihoods of 2,800 people. There is nothing left. Port Talbot is the last bastion of heavy industry in South Wales. So we need to fight. We need to stand up and fight. Thank you.
So he remembers what happened after the coal mines closed in Wales and elsewhere, the fact that those areas weren't reindustrialised. He remembers what happened to the shipyards and the promises that were made, and those areas weren't reindustrialised. So within the DNA in these areas, there's a natural scepticism about promises that are being made. So he's now travelling the country trying to drum up support for himself and the unions to try, as I say, to fight for their livelihoods.
You can understand that cynicism, can't you? Because, you know, the green jobs promise sounds brilliant when politicians talk about it, but it's a reality, isn't it? And whether and how quickly those jobs come through, if at all. I'm interested how you're saying that he's travelling around, so meeting other people who are experiencing similar things, because you've been focusing on Port Talbot, but this isn't just an issue that impacts Port Talbot, is it?
The green transition, I think most people would agree, has huge opportunity in it. We know that we've got to get to net zero by 2050. We know that we've got to create our own energy, green energy. We have to secure our energy future so we're not reliant on so many foreign imports, and that'll reduce people's bills. But there's also a concern about who are going to be the winners and losers. There was a recent report carried out by the Resolution Foundation, who's a left-leaning think tank, that suggested that about 1.3 million industrial jobs will have to fundamentally alter as we transition to green energy. And steel workers would be amongst that, manufacturing jobs would be amongst that. That's a lot of the workforce that would have to tweak and change, perhaps lose hours or perhaps lose their jobs altogether. And the government are very keenly aware of that. And we talk about a just transition. That's a transition to green so that it's not to the detriment of businesses, families and communities. Well, it's hard to see how it's a just transition for the people of Port Talbot, who are very, very directly seeing the impact of a move to green on their jobs. That's not to say that there's not hope on the horizon, because there is in areas like Port Talbot. There's a massive wind farm planned in the Celtic Sea, which Tata hope they'll be able to make the components for. But that's 3, 4, 5 years in the future. So the gap between turning off the old industries and rebuilding the new ones is quite broad, and there are a lot of workers falling in that gap.
Labour completely disagree with Tata about this, don't they?
They do. They've been quite clear that they believe that the 2,800 jobs should be saved with a little bit more money. Now, the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, actually went to Mumbai the other week to meet the boss of Tata to try and appeal to him to keep one of those polluting blast furnaces open, which would save Labour, say, those 2,800 jobs, while work is carried on to build the new one. Tata say that is just not happening. Now, I asked Jonathan Reynolds, how much would that cost to keep that rolling? And he said that Labour would be prepared to pay an extra 100 to 200 million on top of what the existing government's put in, 500 million, to keep it going.
Is it acceptable to expect the taxpayer to spend on top of what they're already spending, which is £500,000, to add more to that? Is that acceptable to ask the taxpayer to do that?
It's what you think is a good deal. I think spending £500,000...
Do you think that's a good deal?
I think the current deal is a bad deal, and I think a better deal is one that retains more jobs, more sovereign capability in the UK from a national security point of view, and fundamentally doesn't tell a story to British workers. Would I spend more money to save more jobs, have more national sovereign capability, and fundamentally be able to say to British workers, the transition will not be one where you lose your job? Would I be willing to do that? Yes, I would.
Just taking a step back, what is your main kind of conclusion, if you like? Because there is obviously a dilemma, as you set out at the beginning, between the need to go green and the desire to protect jobs. Where do you think we're ending up?
I think this is a story about time running out for some people, the economy, and the risk that's involved with going green. Tata Steel have been quite open about this. In fact, they invited us in. We saw the whole operation. They explained their rationale. We went over the finances. This is a company that's losing money, but they say they want to preserve steelmaking in the United Kingdom, and I think they're to be believed when they say that. If they don't switch to this new furnace, they say they'll shut the whole plant down. Why would they continue losing £1 million a day? You know, steel is a solid, reliable product, but the UK industry is quite fragile and it's quite vulnerable. And everyone I've spoken to on all sides of this debate, workers included, know that the future is green steel. It's just getting there that they all disagree on.
Well, let's hope they find some kind of way through. Nick, thank you so much for talking to us on the pod today. You can find Nick's full report on this story on the Sky News website or the YouTube channel. In just a moment, I'll be speaking to a pilot to find out what on earth happened on that turbulent flight to Singapore. Now, we wanted to talk a bit more about one of those stories that just makes you go, what? When you see the news alert or the headline. Now, one person has died after a flight from London ran into severe turbulence on its way to Singapore, and others were also injured. Well, Tim Atkinson is a pilot and aviation consultant. And look, there's a lot we're still learning about this Singapore Airlines flight as we record this. But I guess what I'm interested to know from you, Tim, is from the initial reports coming out, what do you think has gone on here?
Well, it's fairly clear that the aircraft has encountered atmospheric turbulence. There's no suggestion that this is an event with any other cause, although we have seen similar events caused by, for example, flight control issues in the past. Which variety of atmospheric turbulence, and there are several, at the moment is something of a mystery. The geographical location is in an area renowned amongst pilots and, I dare say, passengers for turbulence, an area of the atmosphere called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, where vigorous convective activity happens year-round. It kind of moves up and down with the seasons. Certainly an area which one would fly in with caution. But despite abundant caution, occasionally, there's turbulence ahead which can't be identified. And the unfortunate result of an encounter is injury and very rarely fatality.
It's interesting to hear about the kind of dangers that turbulence could face to people on board an aircrane. So Boeing 777, I mean, that's a pretty big plane. you're assuming that the turbulence must have been quite bad for this to happen to a plane of that size.
Yes, so the larger the aircraft, the worse the atmospheric perturbation, the disruption in the atmosphere, in the smoothness of the atmosphere needs to be to cause major problems. And the 777 is one of the largest and I dare say most solid airframes widely flying around the world. It's regarded as an exceptionally well-built machine in the piloting and aviation fraternity. And for turbulence to have had this effect on a 777, it must have been really quite severe.
And can you anticipate that turbulence is going to happen? I mean, do you check the, apologies for my ignorance, I should say, before I ask this question, but, do you kind of check the weather reports before? Do you get people warning you about turbulence? Can you predict it?
Well, there's no ignorance shown there at all, Sophie. You've kind of hit on the main methods by which it's avoided. So first, strategically. So at the point of briefing before a flight, the crew will look at weather reports and forecasts. They will include turbulence forecasts. And that, together with knowledge of meteorology and climatology, will already have the crew considering parts of the flight during which they will have the seatbelt sign illuminated and everyone's strapped in. They'll be thinking about areas that they might wish to avoid. Then tactically in flight, one begins with a knowledge of the terrain one's flying over because, for example, mountain regions can cause certain types of turbulence. Then reports from other aircraft are very important. Pilots will frequently ask for what are known as ride reports, reports from aircraft ahead on the same route, which can be very helpful. Although, of course, if a particular route hasn't been flown for an hour or two, the first aircraft to fly down it is pretty much seeking their own way. We have airborne weather radar, which is helpful in identifying certain kinds of turbulence, but by no means all. And beyond that, visual observation out of the flight deck and things like watching the rate at which the wind affecting the aircraft is changing. If you know you're operating near a jet stream, which is one of these high-speed cores of wind in the upper atmosphere, you'll be watching the rate at which your wind indication is changing as a measure of how close you are to it and how perhaps you might need to prepare for turbulence ahead. It's still possible to be doing all of those things very diligently and come across turbulence which you simply couldn't see ahead.
What do you do when you hit turbulence? Is there much you can do, or is it just a case of making sure everyone's got their seatbelts on and clearing away the wine glasses?
Well, one would hope that the wine glasses have already been cleared away, but if they haven't, then activities are going to cease. It's going to be a question of getting the cabin sat down and strapped in. So the first action in the flight deck would be to put the seatbelt sign on, possibly make a brief PA announcement, or the cabin crew may do that in accordance with their procedures. Then one would typically reduce speed to what's called the turbulent penetration speed, which is a good speed in between the minimum and maximum for that particular condition of flight. And then very frequently one would seek to descend as well into, in layman's terms, into thicker air. And that enables the aircraft speed to be reduced further. And gives you more margin between the minimum and maximum speeds, which apply to an aircraft in high altitude flight.
I don't mind flying myself, but I know an awful lot of people, some of my sort of friends, who get very nervous about this kind of thing. So I just wonder if there's anything that you'd say to anyone who might be seeing this story in the news and might be feeling a bit worried about that flight they've got booked this summer.
Well, first, for anyone who has real psychological problems, there are a number of courses and books and other things available which might be helpful. But the big message really is when you're in the aircraft, in your seat, have your seatbelt fastened. We did this with motor cars many years ago. It saved many, many lives. And it's advice I've given on every welcome on board PA I think I've ever delivered. And it's probably the soundest advice that I can offer to anyone undertaking a flight anytime soon.
OK, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today. So thanks for making the time.
That's my pleasure, Sophie. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Sky News Daily. Thank you so much for listening to me, Sophy Ridge.